Okay, so in this video, I'm going to get a little theory heavy, but I'll try to explain it. And you're not going to see me because a lot of times these slides have some really important information. So we're going to talk today about cultural patterns and the influence they have not only on our communication, but also just on the way that we see the world. So we'll start off with cultural patterns are defined as shared beliefs, values, norms, and social practices that are stable over time and that lead to roughly similar behaviors across similar situations. So I want you to take a step back for a second and just think about a subculture that you belong to. Please don't pick San Diego or the United States. That's too broad. I really want you to look at a group or a subculture. We talked about them last week that you belong to. And I want you, as we go through these definitions, to really start to think about how this subculture has influenced, for instance, your beliefs. And a belief is an idea that people assume to be true about the world. So think of a silly one, right? Is people used to believe that the world was flat, and that belief came from where you lived in the world and then what the astronomers at that time were telling you. So what beliefs do you have to be true about the world? Now, values are concerned with what a culture regards as good or bad, right or wrong, fair or unfair, beautiful or ugly, valuable or worthless. And so beauty, if you look at beauty, and maybe if you've taken Art 100, you've looked at the beauty that has been depicted in artwork, and you'll see that women, oftentimes their beauty is actually determined based on where they live. So where in the world they live, whether the color of their hair, the color of their eyes, the length of their legs, the shape of their body, it's all determined based on a culture or a subculture that you belong to. Now, norms are the socially shared expectations of appropriate behaviors. So how you're supposed to act, for instance, in class, how you're supposed to act in an establishment that's considered religious, a synagogue, a church, a mosque, whatever it may be. And then lastly, you have social practices that are predictable behavior patterns that members of a culture typically follow. And so I'm going to use, for instance, those who are Muslim. Social practices would be their prayers, their daily prayers. So it's predictable, and it's thought to be something that they are, and I put this in quotes, required to do. Now, if you look at Hofstede's 6 dimensions of culture, Hofstede goes on to say that there are 6 ways that each culture or subculture will kind of direct people for their beliefs, their values, their norms, and their social behaviors. And so we have the power index, which is how we view people on our hierarchical, right? So someone who's a CEO, are they better than you or are they equal to you? Individualism versus collectivism. So am I more for me or more for the we? Masculinity, femininity, and so oftentimes we think of gender appropriate behaviors, and so how are those viewed? Uncertainty avoidance index, and that is how do we handle the uncertainty that happens in our lives? Does it cause stress? Do we learn how to deal with it? Long-term, short-term normative orientation, and that's how we look at the world around us and how we look at the future of what it's going to be. And finally, indulgence versus restraint. Do we give in to our every need, or are we able to restrain ourselves? And so this slide is one that you may want to pause the video and just kind of look at it, because I'm not going to go through it too much. But it tells you how there's an index for how people actually act and behave. And yes, I did spell Hofstede right. Now, cultural patterns, and so that's what we've been talking about, right, is how cultural patterns kind of influence our behaviors, our beliefs, our norms, those sorts of things. So the cultural patterns, basically they give us a set of standards that guide us through thought and through action. And so I've kind of been explaining that, but I want to take just a little bit of a different shift, right? So Hofstede talks about cultural dimensions, but here we have cultural orientation. And this is by Belts. And so culture orientation refers to the way in which individuals or groups perceive, approach, and interact with different cultures. And so in here, it's kind of just a different way of thinking about it. They discuss how that there's the thinking style, there's the sense of self, and then there's also the interaction style. And so you can go on and you can look at Berlitz and you can see that there are different ways that we actually are influencing how we act, think, behave, believe. And that's based on the structural, the thinking, the environment, the time, the action, etc. And again, you can pause this video to kind of go through it in more detail. But basically what it's saying is that cultural patterns, they're not consciously taught. So no one in your life has ever said to you something like, you have to, and I was going to say respect me, but there are some cultures that say you have to respect me because I'm an elder. But there's not a lot of cultures that will tell you, like, you're always supposed to be late, right? But there's cultures that believe being on time is not what we are supposed to do. And then there's other cultures that if you're arriving on time, you're already late. So these are things that we are unconsciously taught through our experiences. And in other words, it helps to form our self-concept, or who we think we are. Now, I'm going to put a pause because next week we're actually going to talk about cultural influences on self, but I didn't want to not kind of introduce this a little bit this week. So let me just give you some examples, because I think that's always the best way to go through this information. There are different ways that our culture has taught us to think about things, about time, about meals, about work, about play, about gender roles. And so as we move through the weeks, what I really want you to start to examine is the cultural patterns that you have, adopted because of your experiences, the cultural patterns that you live by. And I use the example of meals. So I grew up in a very Italian family on the East Coast, and Sunday was family day, but it all revolved around food. And so that's something that I've had to teach myself, is that not all family experiences have to include food. And I know that with my children, I try not to make everything revolve around food, because that's a cultural pattern, but not something necessarily that I wanted to carry forward with my family. Now, there's one other set of theorists that I want to kind of talk about, and that is Cockcomb and Strodbeck. And they look at cultural patterns as, and you can take all of these and put them together, by the way, but they look at cultural patterns and they say that there's 5 ways that we actually see the world: through activity, through relations or relationships, through how we see ourselves, through how we see the world, and through how we see time. And so the last slide I'm going to show you is what the Cockcomb and Strodbeck say, is that all of us have a pendulum. So whether we're masters, we are in harmony with, or we kind of just go along with, or we don't believe with, right? And so we all have, if you look at those 5 areas, and I know this slide is in a different order than the previous slide, but if we go with that 5 areas, that there's ways that we can actually fit along this scale, and that our culture or subculture that we identify with has helped us to get to this. Now, this is a lot of information, and you may have to go back to these slides and even just look at some of them, and that's okay. And the chapter should help make sense of some of it, but I really wanted to show you that there's lots of different theories. If you're in sociology, if you're in psychology, if you're studying communications, that there's many different ways to look at how cultural patterns have influenced us. And not one is right and not one is wrong. In my personal belief, I believe they all kind of meld together and have helped me to identify how I communicate.